Good afternoon or good morning, depending on if you are in Europe or UK, or USA or other parts of the world. But welcome to this session, where we will, with my colleague Tormos, we will chair, moderate, and we will reconnect with the morning session regarding modifiable lifestyles. And we have a top number one presenters, scientists in each particular field. And here we will be talking about nutrition, exercise, social relations, and cognitive functions regarding modifiable protective lifestyles for brain health. And this, I think it will be a great session. So if Chema, if you want to add something, or otherwise we can move forward and introduce the speakers.
Yeah, I'm really eager and willing to hear them and just go ahead. Thank you for agreeing to join us in this course, and let's go to share the things with the audience.
Hello, I'm Dr. Emili. The topic of my conference this afternoon is nutrition and brain health, and I'm going to detail the foods and dietary patterns that affect beneficially brain function, mostly because they are rich in antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds.
My name is Kramer. I'm at Northeastern University in Boston, and I'll be talking today about physical activity and exercise and its effects on cognitive and brain health, talking mostly about the work we've done in our lab, both at the University of Illinois and Northeastern, but also the general literature.
I'm Joaquin Anguera from UC San Francisco, and I'll be talking about the potential to improve cognitive function across the lifespan.
Okay, so I guess we are good to go with Emili Rose. Emili Rose, sorry. He's an outstanding scientist in the field of nutrition, and has led very important studies such as the PREDIMED prevention with a Mediterranean diet and the WAHA walnut nutrition study to see the benefits in the brain. And I'm really looking forward to hear about your presentation. Thank you, Emili.
So for my talk, I will say that there is room for preventive intervention for cognitive impairment and dementia because of these three interrelated modifiable risk factors: sedentariness, vascular risk factors, and unhealthy nutrients, foods, and diets. I will not talk about exercise, obviously, but the three of them are interrelated because unhealthy foods or diets will potentiate vascular risk factors and also will do sedentariness. So all of them are important because the main factors in cognitive decline dementia, which call for a possible solution in nutrition, are oxidative stress and chronic inflammation. And together with vascular impairment, they are believed to mediate in great part age-related cognitive decline and its progression to dementia. So it follows that foods dietary patterns that are rich in antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds and reduce vascular risk when consumed frequently are good candidates to foster brain health. There is persuasive evidence, preclinical evidence from animal experiments that some foods or nutrients, which usually belong to the polyphenol antioxidant category, protect against deterioration of brain function and impairment of motor and cognitive tasks. And here I mentioned several: ginkgo biloba, curry, apples, berries, juices from grape and pomegranate, extra virgin olive oil, nuts, and walnuts have been most studied in this regard, cocoa and spinach. They share the fact that they are very rich in polyphenols. And another important point, which is really a fashion, I would say, nowadays, which is intermittent fasting or intermittent food deprivation. There is also preclinical evidence that is beneficial for brain health. When you are fasting, your metabolism switches from burning glucose to burning fatty acids. This produces ketone bodies like beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. And these are good foods for the brain. The brain, instead of burning glucose, burns ketone bodies. By doing so, also insulin sensitivity is improved. And these ketone bodies influence adaptive cellular signaling pathways that lead to enhanced neurotrophic factors, enhanced GABAergic tone, antioxidant enzymes, DNA repair, reduce inflammation. They all go in favor of synaptic plasticity, neurogenesis, and neuroprotection. And then, obviously, to optimal cognitive function. While the contrary, the food overconsumption just promotes insulin resistance. Also, it impairs cognition by itself and leads to the contrary or the opposed metabolic pathways that end up in suboptimal cognition or vulnerability to injury and disease. And this has been much studied in animals, but there is no proof in humans yet. The paper from which this figure is taken is really a very good review on the topic, and I encourage you to read it. So going back to fruits and to antioxidant-rich foods, there is the clinical evidence is weak from on the effects of diet and observation on cognitive function. And this comes from observational studies and from randomized controlled trials. So the association of better cognitive function or reduced dementia with these diets is controversial. Some have given positive results, some studies, others neutral results. In no case, negative results. So fruits and vegetables, seeds like whole grains, nuts, legumes, cocoa and coffee, vitamin C and E and carotenoids, folate and vitamin B12, flavonoids, which are a type of polyphenols abundant in cocoa and virgin olive oil, then fish. Fish, it stands in itself because omega-3 fatty acids are critical for the neuronal membrane. So they have been much studied, and I'll show you something right after. Red wine and tea, and I underline in green all those that are also rich in polyphenols. Okay, so logically, like in the animal experiments, human data favor foods rich in polyphenols, but as I say, it's controversial mostly. Regarding fish, there is omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. This is from a recent meta-analysis on the intake of fish and omega-3 fatty acids and cognitive impairment. This deals with synthesizes data from 21 cohorts. And here on the left side, you see a dose-response association between fish and the relative risk of dementia. And as you see, the more fish you consume, and it's shown in servings per week, the less dementia you will suffer. And on the right, the dose response is for omega-3 fatty acids and mild cognitive impairment. And you see a similar dose-response relationship, but here the axis is dietary omega-3 fatty acids in grams per day. So there is good epidemiological evidence that habitual fish intake is good for brain health. But what happened with randomized controlled trials? There have been 25 randomized controlled trials, 19 of them could be labeled as of high quality, assessing supplements of omega-3 fatty acids for outcomes of cognition, mostly for cognition, not for Alzheimer's disease or dementia. As you see, the study size ranges from 28 to 3,000, age at enrollment from 22 to 75 years, the doses of omega-3 from 0.3 to 3 grams per day, and the duration of the study is from 4 weeks to 5 years. But the results is no effect on global cognition and perhaps a slight memory improvement in some of these trials. So you see that having fish all your life, as is derived from epidemiological studies, is protective, but taking supplements for a limited period of time, up to 5 years, does not protect your brain. Now we go back to these foods that are rich in polyphenols. Most of them are part of the Mediterranean diet. You have olive oil, cereals like bread, pasta, and rice, fresh vegetables and fruits, legumes, tree nuts, aromatic herbs and spices, moderate consumption of wine. And also there is the frequent intake of fish for omega-3 fatty acids. Then there is a low intake of meat and animal products, milk products, except yogurt and cheese, and simple sugars. So there have been many prospective studies assessing adherence to the Mediterranean diet in relation to health outcomes. That's a meta-analysis that shows that every 2-point increase in a 9-point score of adherence to the Mediterranean diet will result in a close to 10% reduction in relative risk of cardiovascular incidence and mortality, total mortality, cancer mortality or incidence, and importantly, neurodegenerative diseases. But this is epidemiology, and one needs really harder data. We go back to epidemiology. Here, there have been 14 studies reporting results of adherence to the Mediterranean diet versus other diets for global cognition. And you see here on the forest plot that most of the points are either on the identity line or to the right, and that the overall effect is positive. So the Mediterranean diet has a beneficial effect on cognition. Similar results have been obtained for incident dementia or incident Alzheimer's disease, also for depression and Parkinson's disease. And in the last 6 years, there have been also several studies showing neuroimaging results of relation to the Mediterranean diet, always from observational studies. And here I point some of the findings. Increased Mediterranean diet will increase cortical thickness, have result in a greater brain volume, a larger dentate gyrus, slower rate of hippocampal atrophy, improve structural connectivity, and reduce amyloid accumulation. So there is really a whole body of evidence, epidemiological evidence on the benefit of the Mediterranean diet for cognition and brain health. But as I say, this is epidemiology and we need hard data. Hard data comes from randomized controlled trials. And I was privileged to be part of this Preventive study, which was a landmark trial assessing the effects of Mediterranean diets on the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease as primary outcome. The Preventive participants were men and women older than 55 or 60, up to 80 years old, who were at high risk of cardiovascular disease because they either had type 2 diabetes or 3 conventional cardiovascular risk factors. When I say that they were at high risk of cardiovascular disease, I can also say that they were at high risk for brain degeneration or for dementia, because they share these risk factors. So we randomized 7,500 participants to 3 diets: Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, a Mediterranean diet supplemented with mixed nuts, and here this shows the doses of nuts, daily doses of nuts that were given, and a control low-fat diet, advice on low-fat diet. And this is our participants. As you can see, they are all and they are right at the point of having either a heart attack or a cognitive dysfunction. The results of this study, the main results, were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and this is the main outcome: cardiovascular disease, which means myocardial infarction, stroke, or death from these causes. And as you can see, there was a 30% more or less reduction in the incidence of the main outcome with the two Mediterranean diets, very similar one to another, and compared to the control diet. And this was really a very impressive result, because it represents a type of protection like that afforded by statins. These people were already taking statins, most of them. So we took advantage of the cohort that was recruited at Hospital Clínic in Barcelona to perform some neuropsychological tests and see what happened with them with the Mediterranean diets. And well, this was done in 450 participants. The battery of tests was done at baseline after 4 years. The changes of neuropsychological tests were standardized to Z-scores, and we constructed 3 composites: memory, executive function, and global cognition. And the effects were adjusted, the data was adjusted by the usual factors that can affect cognition, including ApoE4 genotype. These are the main results of that study. Of note, if you look at the darkest columns, they represent the effects of the control diet on the memory score on the left, frontal cognition in the center, and global cognition on the right. And you see that during the 4 years of the study, they all decreased. That's what one would expect in high-risk people. During the passage of time, it's a time-related cognitive dysfunction. However, in the 2 Mediterranean diets, we don't see that. We see the contrary. The deterioration is totally slowed down, but even reversed by the extra virgin olive oil more in frontal cognition, and by the nuts more in memory, and both in the global. So that's really the first time a dietary pattern was assessed in a randomized controlled trial for an outcome of cognitive function. And the results were, as you can see, very rewarding. And we can say that other Predimed data confirm, that the brain health outcomes. Like in Predimed, we saw reduced incidence of stroke, decreased depression, reduced blood pressure, and prevention of diabetes. And all of them are factors that will promote dementia or cognitive dysfunction. And in sub-cohorts, we also demonstrated improved insulin sensitivity, reduced inflammation and oxidation, regression of carotid atherosclerosis, reduced ambulatory blood pressure, and higher plasma brain-derived neurotrophic factor concentration. So, see, the Mediterranean diet in Predimed really had lots of beneficial effects on metabolism, on cardiovascular outcomes, and also in brain-related outcomes. So from the Mediterranean diet, we can say that there is consistent data from prospective studies and the Predimed randomized trial to support a beneficial effect on the risk of cognitive decline. And we know also from epidemiology that there is suggestive evidence that increased adherence to the med diet also reduces the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Other diets that have been postulated to improve cognition is the MIND diet, Mediterranean and Dutch intervention diet, which is a mixture of Mediterranean and Nordic diet, one would say. The fruit emphasized in the MIND diet are berries, which are very rich in antioxidants. And there's beginning to be some evidence on the good effects for cognition of this diet. Now, to finish, I want to show the studies we did with nuts. These are nuts, cocoa, chocolate, coffee, are seeds. Seeds have a very good composition in nutrients, and they are expected to benefit health. And also berries, fruit juice, and fish, we've talked about them as good foods for cognition. Now, why did we choose walnuts? Well, because walnuts look like a brain, you would say, so they should improve the brain. Yeah. Well, no, in really, walnuts are very rich in unsaturated fatty acids, both omega-6 and omega-3. Alpha-linolenic acid is the vegetable omega-3 fatty acid. They have fiber, protein, like arginine, minerals, non-sodium minerals, vitamin E, phytosterols, and it's a very rich source of polyphenols, and it also contains melatonin. So really good nutrients for the brain. Plus, randomized controlled trials have shown that nuts, walnuts in particular, have a consistent cholesterol-lowering effect and improve endothelial function. And we know from PREDIMED that they also reduce cardiovascular disease and stroke, but it was not nuts themselves. It was in the context of Mediterranean diet. And from epidemiological studies, reduce cardiovascular disease, reduce hypertension, reduce depression, and improve cognition with walnuts. So we designed a study, a relatively large study with more than 700 cognitively healthy elders, which were recruited in 2 centers, Barcelona and Loma Linda, California, with a common protocol. They were randomized to usual diet, which was their control, or the same usual diet with walnuts at 15% of energy. That means from 15 to 30 grams per day. The main outcomes of the WAHA study were walnuts and healthy aging, that's WAHA, cognitive function, and age-related macular degeneration. And this year, early this year, we published the results of the cognitive outcome, and we were privileged to have David Bartrés as part of the team, because he did some studies on brain magnetic resonance imaging, but I'm sorry that I cannot show them because of lack of time. One of the things that we didn't expect is that walnuts didn't work for 2 years. We had with the pool results of the 2 centers, the composite scores on memory, language, perception, frontal function, or global cognition didn't change. They all decreased during these 2 years in this elderly population. However, there was an interaction between the results, the data, and center. So we looked at the centers apart. In Loma Linda, in California, there were no differences, but in Barcelona, there were differences. And walnuts really improved, or at least delayed, the deterioration of global cognition seen during these 2 years. So the WAHA, the results were neutral, considering the pooled data. And one can say one limitation is that 2 years may not be enough to see changes in cognition. Also, the fact that the WAHA participants were quite healthy, so not only cognitively, but physically. And here is the healthy participant effect. The lower risk factor levels are, the less they can be improved by an intervention. But the pre-specified functional brain MRI performed by David in Barcelona subsample and post-hoc analysis by site show a positive cognitive outcome only in the Barcelona center. What was a likely reason? Well, Barcelona participants were more at risk because they had 5 years less of education than Loma Linda ones. And that's very easy to explain because they went to school during Franco's years, so there was not much equal opportunities in Spain at that time. So, WAHA, we are obtaining other data which can support improvement in health, like reduced telomere attrition with time, decreased blood pressure, induction of exosomal microRNAs targeting apoptosis, reduce circulating inflammatory molecules, and anti-atherogenic shift or lipoprotein particles. All these have been published except the last one, which is under review. So to finish, nutrition and brain health conclusions, abundant experimental evidence of cognitive benefit from antioxidant-rich plants, plant foods, and time-restricted feeding. Moderate observational evidence of cognitive benefit from seeds, particularly walnuts, cocoa and coffee, leafy vegetables, berries, fruit juices, red wine, tea, and seafood. And as I pointed out, fish also benefits Alzheimer's disease. Consistent observational evidence of benefit from Mediterranean diet on cognition and dementia. Incipient randomized clinical trial evidence of cognitive benefit from nuts, walnuts, and the Mediterranean diet. And I dare to say that the most effective preventive strategy would be probably targeting individuals more at risk of dementia because of lower education, more vascular risk factors, higher future dementia risk scores, ApoE4 or brain amyloid positivity. And this would have better chances of obtaining a positive impact. These were the sponsors of our studies, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ros. And now it is my pleasure to introduce all of you to Professor Arthur Kramer, who is the director of the Center for Cognitive and Brain Health and also professor of psychology at Northeastern University. And Professor Kramer is probably one of the person in the world with most experience about how to benefit from physical exercise in order to improve or to optimize plasticity and improve cognitive function. So thank you very much for accept to join us, and it is I'm very sure that this is going to be a pleasure for the audience to hear you. Thank you, Professor.
Before I start, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators, both in Spain and elsewhere in the world. Some of them I know will be part of the presentation, many of them in the US too. So thanks to all, and thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me. One of the reasons that we got involved in this research several decades ago was based upon the animal research, which has shown that exercise, as well as a number of other factors, and we see exercise on the bottom right with a little rodent on the treadmill. They usually aren't on treadmills, although monkeys can be. But this was work done by Bill Greeno and Diamond and many others that examined changes in the structure and function of the brain as a function of different lifestyle issues and challenges, things like social interaction, illustrated in the bottom left, exploration or cognitive exploration, we'll hear about both later, and the Cirque du Soleil animal on the top right there. So in terms of what I'll tell you today, and it'll be relatively brief, of course, like all the presentations, just briefly, I'll tell you about a little bit about the animal research, some of the human work, which starts with meta-analyses, and we've heard about meta-analyses with respect to diet, and they exist in all of our fields, that's for sure. And then some additional fitness research and exercise research. To start off with some of the animal research, this is a figure from a colleague and friend, Henriette van Praag, and it illustrates the way the exercise studies are done with animals and pretty much the way they're done with humans too. There tends to be at least two conditions, a running wheel in a cage or enclosure or not. BRDU labels dividing cells. We don't do that with humans. The water maze is a test of learning and memory under stress, finding a platform and a bath of opaque water, and then there tends to be some histology and electrophysiology in many of the experiments. And on this slide, the top panel are photomicrographs from Rusty Gage's lab at UCSD, and those little green dots are new neurons being born as a function of exercise, as illustrated by the bar graph in the top right. The RUs are the runners, ENs are enriched environment, and COs are the controls. So neurogenesis certainly occurs, but so do a number of other things listed on the bottom of the slide, including increased neurotrophins or nerve growth factors, synaptogenesis or interconnections among different neurons, angiogenesis, or often a richer blood supply with capillary beds, and a variety of other things, including, if we go down towards the middle there, reduced beta amyloid protein and transgene mouse models. So what that suggests is that you can create at least partial Alzheimer's models with rodents, and that exercise will downregulate some of the neuropathology precursors like beta amyloid and tau. So we have pretty good evidence for that now. So we know after about 2.5 to 3 decades, we know quite a bit about the molecular and cellular biology of exercise. So a little bit about the meta-analyses. What do we know from the meta-analyses of the human research? And here's one done a number of years ago and briefly updated a couple of years ago, which suggests that the kind of task that you use to assess exercise benefits might indeed benefit, might influence the results. The white bars indicate the aerobic exercise conditions of older adults over 60, and the gray bars indicate the active control, which is often toning, stretching, and strengthening. And we see differences between the control and exercise conditions across all of these situations, but we see bigger differences for some cognitive abilities like executive control, working memory, dealing with ambiguity, dealing with inhibition, and a variety of other processes, cognitive flexibility. And we can go to move all the way to another meta-analysis last year. There have been dozens of meta-analyses in this field. And this is a meta-analysis out of Teresa Lou Ambrose's lab at University of British Columbia in Canada. And they found very similar things. The effect sizes tend to be somewhere in the small to medium range in terms of benefits for cognition. Teresa and her students also looked at physical benefits, and there most certainly are physical benefits, again, depending upon the nature of the exercise. Most of the exercise studies have been aerobic, but more and more tend to be resistance or weightlifting, as well as Eastern practices, which are a combination, things like Tai Chi and yoga and so forth. So what about some of the human research? So this is an illustration of the two conditions, much like the animal research. Mr. or Ms. Centipede said walking is the best exercise. And I'm not sure if it's the best, but it's a frequently done exercise, especially among older adults. And Mr. Gumby didn't do his stretching, and look what happened to him. So stretching and toning tends to be a control condition for many of the human, especially the older age, exercise studies. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the research that's been done with respect to brain measures, and this is both MRI and fMRI. These are panels from a study that we did a number of years ago now, and the little blue dots on the brain slices, the first two on the left are parallel to the floor if somebody's standing up. The little blue dots indicate areas in which over a 6-month period, exercising 3 days a week, about an hour a day, simply walking, compared to a control of toning and stretching, that brain volume increases in gray matter areas. The yellow region is in the front of the anterior commissure of the corpus callosum, the genu, and that's increases in the volume of white matter. So we see both gray and white matter changes from a pretty modest exercise regimen with older adults from about 60 to 80. We can hone in on particular nuclei. We know from the animal literature that the hippocampus is pretty important. That's where neurogenesis occurs. And I'm not suggesting we know that with humans, because we do not. Our tests, our measures are too crude. But if you compare the blue and the red bars, the blue bars are the individuals who've been walking 3 days a week for a year, and we do assessments before 6 months and after the year, and the red bars are individuals who have been doing toning and stretching. It's always an active control. And what we find here is an increase in the volume of the hippocampus, but not so much of a change in a number of other nuclei, such as the caudate and the thalamus. And again, this is with older people. With children, and we also work with children, we see some different effects. So we see changes in gray matter areas. They're probably a concatenation of angiogenesis, synaptogenesis, maybe some neurogenesis, and a variety of other things. This is a panel from a study we did a number of years ago, a couple of studies actually. And here we're comparing VO2 max, which is the gold standard for cardiorespiratory fitness, to the integrity of white matter using an FA measure and diffusion tensor imaging. And what we see is that when we have a bigger difference among individuals or change, depending upon the nature of the study, we see a bigger benefit in terms of white matter integrity. So both gray and white matter tend to benefit. And this is across the 4 panels illustrate different tracks in the brain that are illustrated on the top and the bottom brain slices. But what about brain function? And one notion that we tested in a variety of studies is whether we know that aerobic fitness, as on the bottom here, is related to cognition. We've seen that time and time again, both in the meta-analyses and in the empirical studies that go into them. But we wanted to ask whether functional connectivity among different brain regions was responsible, at least for part of that benefit. And one way to look at it is in terms of different neural networks. Many of them have been outlined. Yao has started out with 7, gone to 14, and there are many others that have been defined. And the default mode network is often recorded when people are introspecting rather than processing information from the environment. The dorsal attention network supports different aspects of attention, executive control network, and salience. So we're able to look at these different networks. And here's an illustration of young and old differences on the top. And what we see here is that young adults have many more connections within network. And if we look at the bottom, older people tend to have more connections among or between networks. This is often referred to as dedifferentiation, a process of changing in network structure that corresponds to changes in cognition as a function of age. And these are data from a large cross-sectional study, but the panel on the right illustrates essentially what we see if we add in the middle bar in each color, we add in a group that's low fit versus high fit for older adults. And what we see, we also have the younger in the diagonal hatch marks, we see that the older high fit adults look more like the younger adults, that is more connections within networks as compared to between networks. So is that a good thing? Well, we'll address that in a second. These are data from a fairly large, at least at the time, randomized controlled trial. And what we did was to look at connectivity in different networks. They're labeled here, default and frontal executive and other networks, as a function of when we recorded the data in the magnet, as people went through, older adults went through a year-long exercise program of 3 sessions, 3 one-hour sessions a week. And the blue bars indicate the control, that's the toning, stretching, and light strengthening. And the yellowish orange bars indicate the aerobic group, they're simply walking. And one of the trends we see in all of these panels, you can choose any one you want to look at here, is that the connectivity increases within these networks, as I just showed you in the cross-sectional data, as a function of more aerobic exercise, and presumably, and in this case it's certainly true, increases in aerobic fitness. The unfilled bar, labeled YA, are actually 20 to 30-year-olds. And what we see is that after a year-long exercise program, the individuals in the aerobic group approach those and are actually non-significantly different from the connectivity of the young adults. So a number of interesting things happen. We can also look at the relationship between changes in connectivity and also changes in cognition. And we use latent variables here, in this case, for executive function and short-term memory. And what we see is that individuals who show increases in within network connectivity tend to show increases in executive function. It's a small to modest correlation. So we can put a little check mark here at the bottom that indeed we find that functional connectivity is an important mediator of the aerobic fitness cognition relationship. But we can also look at other variables as a way to try to bring together the human research and the animal research. The animal research often records from brain tissue or selects from brain tissue neurotrophins like brain-derived neurotrophin factor or BDNF. And we see a connectivity panel on the left, and on the right, we see the relationship between BDNF change as a function of the year-long exercise program and connectivity change within networks. And on the top, the non-aerobic group doesn't show any significant correlation, whereas on the bottom, there is quite a significant correlation of 0.57. So again, these results are similar to the kinds of results you see in the animal studies. This is a plot from a paper with my colleague Lars Nyberg and Lars Johansson, and I know Lars will be talking tomorrow about a different topic. But this was using, this study was, again, with older adults and using positron emission tomography, using a dopamine ligand to look at the relationship between fitness differences. Again, think of this as dose response on the x-axis, and DRD2 residuals, which is a metric that measures dopamine effectiveness or efficiency. And again, like the animal research, we can see changes in neurotransmitters as a function of changes in exercise. So the issue that I'd like to briefly address now is whether we can use predict future benefits in fitness, which would be very important in designing fitness training programs, or in fact, cognitive training programs or any kind of training program for that matter. And let me briefly tell you about what we're doing. We're actually using a metric called brain modularity, which is a ratio of the connectivity within networks as compared to between networks. And we look at that before we start off with the study, and we ask whether brain modularity, based upon the literature that shows it can predict learning benefits with older adults, learning benefits with traumatic brain injury patients, and also with kids, the extent of the benefits. So with higher modularity, higher within network connectivity, we tend to get bigger benefits. And we asked whether the same is true for exercise in our older subject sample. So here on the right-hand side, we have 4 different groups, 2 different walking groups, a dance group, and a toning and stretching in blue, and about 100 participants. We see that executive function changes, that is, improves in these individuals differentially across groups, not so much in the dance group, across a year-long intervention. And then the next question is, what's the relationship between executive function improvements, which is on the y-axis in all of these plots, and modularity? And we see a significant relationship in all of these cases. So like traumatic brain injuries, like cognitive differences, we see that this metric can actually predict improvements, individual differences in improvements in exercise. This is a panel from a recent study with kids. The orange bar is a physical activity program with kids. The gray blue bar is a control condition. And here we also see on the y-axis, we have on the top executive function. In the middle, this is cognitive efficiency, a measure of cognitive efficiency. And on the bottom, it's math composite achievement score. And we see in all cases, even with children, exercise can predict benefits. And this is a panel from a paper by Mark D'Esposito out of his lab, which suggests that baseline modularity in a meta-analysis he did relates to training gain. And we know now it's not simply cognitive, but it's cognitive and it's tends to be fitness-based. So one unanswered question is whether it's possible to modify brain network modularity and therefore boost individuals' benefit from exercise training. That we don't yet know, but we are working on that issue. We've also developed a number of new tools for studying fitness, brain, and cognition, and anything else you'd like to study. And one of them is a tool which measures the mechanical processes of massive numbers of cells, because we're doing this using magnetic resonance imaging. It's called viscoelasticity. I can't go into all the details now, but I'd be happy to send you the papers. And we looked at this issue of whether hippocampal viscoelasticity can mediate the difference between fitness, in this case cardiovascular, and memory performance, and it indeed does, and does so better than other measures of structure. So in terms of this work, we've also done other work looking at variability measures, not simply mean fMRI measures, and they too tend to show us some interesting effects. But another topic I wanted to address is whether there's a point of no return, whether individuals with a lot of pathology can still show benefits in terms of fitness benefits on cognition. And just let me simply say that was early Alzheimer's on the top, work by Patricia Henn, multiple sclerosis patients on the right and Parkinson's patients on the bottom left, that all of these groups show benefits from fitness training, of course, from a different baseline in terms of brain structure, brain function in the Parkinson's patients, and cognition as measured with computer-based behavioral measures from the early Alzheimer's. I'm going to skip this one. I'll go on to the next one. So far, I've told you just about older adults, but we've done a lot of work over the years with children, and we continue to do so both with a group in Granada, Spain, and here in Boston. And what we see here on the top left is, again, one of these mediator plots. Aerobic fitness is related to relational memory, something that hippocampus does. If we move to the top right, we see a difference between lower fit children and higher fit children in terms of hippocampal volume. Bottom left, we see that the kids differ in terms of relational memory, not non-relational item memory, so it tends to be specific to the hippocampus, and that there is this dose response on the bottom right between relational memory and hippocampal volume. So a lot of what I've told you about with the older adults is also consistent with the kids. I'll skip over this one, but we do a lot of VR work, virtual reality. So we try to create real world situations. This, if I would have shown it to you, would have been crossing a street, challenging street crossing. And we find out in the data in this plot here that especially on the right-hand side, the kids who are higher fit don't move faster, they think more efficiently, and they don't get run over. Of course, we run them over virtually. We don't run them over in real life, nor would we ever want to do that. So it actually, fitness seems to affect decision processes in addition, of course, to motor processes. So to briefly sum up, I think what I've been able to show you, I know very briefly, and there's a ton of literature, and I'd be happy to point interested folks to the literature, that fitness training, or in this case, mostly aerobic, but other kinds of exercise, improves a variety of perceptual and cognitive abilities, increases brain volume in regions that normally show age-related decline, including the hippocampus, changes functional brain networks, often in the direction for older people of younger adults, and in the other direction for kids, and I didn't show you that. There are promising but fewer fitness and cognitive brain effects with children, but an increasing database. And I didn't cover today, but exercise also appears to decrease anxiety and depression and increase self-esteem and self-efficacy. Of course, there are lots of unanswered questions for the young people listening to the talks. Understanding the boundary conditions on exercise effects. Some studies show bigger exercise effects on cognition and brain health than others. Combining different interventions, social, physical activity, cognitive, diet, when, how much, what's the best sequence, and whether the mechanisms are the same and different. We've looked at some genetic moderators. We continue to do so. So have others. There are genetic moderators of benefits. And of course, trying to move beyond the laboratory door out into the real world, which we occasionally try to do. Well, let me go back here. In terms of combining different interventions, we recently finished a large study where we looked at decision-making, or what people call fluid intelligence, adaptive reasoning and problem solving. And we had different conditions: fitness training only, fitness training in Mind Frontiers, which is a gamified cognitive training task that I developed with a student, Pauline Bankert, and then adding in meditation. And we can see the effect sizes under Cohen-D and the measures. And what we find is that there are a number of benefits. That is, it is possible to change decision-making accuracy and efficiency. And fitness tends to be the big winner. It tends to be in most of these equations here with some of the other variables. We didn't use diet. That would have been very interesting to use for sure. I just wanted to make the brief point that many global councils in many countries across the world are now taking the data that has been produced over the last couple of decades and trying to make easy to follow suggestions for older adults. And this is from the Global Council on Brain Health, which is a collaborative approach of AARP in the United States and brain something or other age, Britain, or a British organization, and produce these kinds of handouts or PDFs for older adults as a way to try to capitalize on the research. So that's it today for me. Thank you for listening. I'm done.
So thank you very much, Professor Kramer. That was a great and inspiring talk. I enjoyed very much. as you say at the end of your presentation, I think that we are now seeing separately nutrition, exercise, and now we'll see social relations, but these are also need to be combined at some point and investigated all together, because as humans we do all these things, right? So
Right.
now it's my real pleasure to introduce Professor Amar Dhand. And I had the chance and the privilege to be in Boston 2 years ago, the Álvaro Pascual Leone lab, and I met Amar, and I was impressed by the very innovative approach, the person-centered approach that he's using to quantitatively measure social networks, so that the persons of the entourage of one given person, and how the structure of these relationships are related to aspects of brain health, recover from diseases, and perhaps even secondary prevention of a stroke. And I'm sure this will be a great talk in this regard. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me, David, Alvaro, and this great initiative, very progressive agenda. And I'm very happy to speak after Dr. Kramer, whose work I follow. We're going to be talking here about social networks and brain health. And the agenda is fundamentally a description of some of the data that's quite convincing onto the effects of social relations on brains, but also some of the innovative methods and new directions that we are taking in order to measure this important effect and try to make it a tractable phenomenon that we can actually modulate to help patients or normal individuals. My research is supported by the NIH and these other foundations. I have no financial disclosures. So I'll start by just indicating the importance of social life to human life. Right from Aristotle, the human beings were thought of as political animals at home in the dense and complicated social web of the polis or the city, and ill-equipped to thrive in isolation. We're intrinsically interdependent, vulnerable. We need each other. And this is not a deficit, but it's actually the central genius or beauty of our species. And then our lab is interested in what happens when we're prevented from participating actively or verbally in our community. This may be one of the main questions that we need to solve and provide solutions for. Recently, a postdoctoral associate in my laboratory, Ian Corbin, wrote about this in the New York Times. I highlight this because in America, we have this fetish with individualism and not showing vulnerability. And we have a lack of, some sociologists say, a lack of community building in our culture. And that leads to ill health and devastating health consequences in terms of the effects of social isolation, neurologically, but also systemically in the body. I borrow this from the World Health Organization. The social determinants of health have been an important framing of some of these social factors. I like their definition, which is health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmary. There's these different layers that one thinks of when you think of social determinants of health. There's general social, economic, cultural, environmental. There are environmental conditions around the place you live and work. And then there are social and community networks. These are the intimate relationships you have with friends, family, acquaintances. And then of course there's lifestyle factors and then your demographics and other elements. These are all work in concert. And one of the things that we like about the social and community networks level is that we think of it as a meso level. It's a moderator of some of these larger, wider issues and the individual factors. Also from a clinician's perspective, we believe it's a layer that's actually tangible and actionable by clinical intervention. I think The other broader elements are more tractable and actionable on a policy level or public health level. But when you're seeing a patient in front of you, it's difficult to address those elements in the clinic, whereas I think the community and at least the social networks are quite, I'll show you, I hope they're addressable based on our methods. First, some intriguing data. Dr. Kramer just went through some of the animal literature on the importance of a complex and enriched environment on brains in mice. This has been well shown from at least the 1970s onward. And in humans, there's also some great data, especially in some of these sort of natural experiments that have happened. This was a recent study of long Antarctic explorers or expeditioners who've spent 9 months in socially isolated conditions. And they had MRIs done pre and post this experience. And they found specific and validated changes in particular areas of the brain that's labeled here: the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, orbital frontal cortex, and perihippocampal gray. They actually found atrophy or reduction in volume in these areas, even in just a short time frame of 9 months. And then they were, this was in concert with biomarker changes that showed increased stress hormone levels and other biomarker changes. So this is the acute effect of loneliness, acute effect of social isolation on the brain. The mechanisms are multiple and complex. There are indirect mechanisms of social isolation effects on the brain, including the combined effects of social isolation with the predominant elements of smoking, inactivity, and poor sleep. These run together. And then there's direct effects. As I showed you, there's nervous system changes, there are immune deregulation, and there's reduced biorecovery. A really nice summary of these are written about in these papers at the bottom here. For your dinner table conversation tonight, I suggest you mention this. Being socially isolated is the same as smoking 3/4 packs of cigarettes a day. And social isolation and loneliness confer a 29% increase of mortality. That's equivalent to obesity. That's equivalent to hypertension and diabetes. But yet in our clinical work, we do not screen for social isolation very regularly. We do not map social networks regularly. Why not? If we are, assessing blood tests for diabetes and we check high blood pressure every clinical visit across the world, why aren't we screening for this, which is perhaps an equivalent risk factor to death? So how do we do this? This is what my group has. I wouldn't say we've pioneered this in medicine because it's so visible in sociology. It's been methodology like this has been done for a long time. We basically adopted it and we adapted it to a patient population, particularly in a neurology clinic. So we first start with the definition. A social network in our scenario is a stable but evolving relational fabric comprising our family members, friends, and friendly acquaintances who are interconnected in different ways. And this is a picture of a person in the middle who we are interviewing, and then their social network are these people around them. We generate the names of these people by asking very particular, well-validated questions, such as who do you discuss personal matters with on a regular basis? Who do you socialize with on a regular basis? And then who do you turn to for support if you had a health crisis? These generate a list of names, and then you ask the interconnections of those names. How are you connected to Frank? Are you especially close or in between? And then how is Frank connected to Mary? And you go through every iteration and you get a graph. So similar to the brain networks, again, that Dr. Kramer was talking about, here we have social networks or social connectome. And we use the same mathematical basis, graph theory, to try to make this quantification, a quantified element of the social world. Now, mechanistically, how does this graph affect the patient's health? Well, there's very good literature that support is based within this network, and that there are certain parts of the network that provide tangible support, informational support, instrumental support, as well as emotional support. And usually those are, as in this case, the red ties, the ties that are very strong. In this, the nomenclature here is red is strong tie and blue is a weak tie. The second mechanism of how social networks influence health is through information. Particularly if you have different subgroups in your network, you actually have a diversity of information that is coming to you, and that information affects your decision-making around whether, for instance, you go to the hospital or whether you take your medications. So information is the second big mechanism of linkage. And then the third is health habits. So if you're surrounded by people who eat healthy, you're more likely to have a social norm of eating healthy. If you're surrounded by people who eat unhealthy, then the opposite is true. So these are the three major ways we believe that the social network facilitates health changes and health outcomes. Think of ties as channel of influence. So we've created a REDCap tool. It's available across the world, in which you can actually administer our survey, and then we have a pipeline in which you can actually create statistics and graphs like this. And you can do it remotely, so you could send an email link to participants and have them fill out the survey and then generate these sort of results. This was a study done on 1,488 people across the United States over just 2.5 months, in which we sent them an email link and they filled out the survey, and we were able to generate these beautiful graphs. I just want you to take into for doctors, this is a big deal in that we're not just talking about one person anymore. We're talking about this collective, and that becomes a variable in the person's behavior. And these are the variety of structures that contain a certain person. So let me give you some evidence as to how these networks manifest into especially neurologic changes or neurologic outcomes. One of the big problems in stroke, ischemic stroke, is that we have a problem with delay of arrival. So 75% of patients in the United States, but actually this is a phenomenon across the world, arrive after 3 hours of stroke symptoms. This has been studied from various individualistic approaches, and they show that there are common elements like age and social economic status that may have an impact, but these findings have not been have been conflicted. There's some studies that show opposing results. And so we took a social network approach. We realized that, hey, this isn't just an individual phenomenon. Actually, 70% of people have strokes that occur at home, and 80% of strokes occur in the presence of others. So the decision to act is actually a social network decision, not an individual decision. And so we studied the networks of the patients as they entered the hospital, and we asked them we administered our survey, and we found two major sort of structures. One was what we call a bonding structure, a high constraints structure, in which a patient is embedded in this smaller, densely connected structure of people who are connected to each other. That's in opposed to a bridging structure, a structure of individuals who are connected perhaps in subgroups to each other, but not necessarily all connected together. And the patient's sort of in between as a bridge. We call this a low constraint network. And so I always ask, the audience, which person is, if everything else is equal, same age, same race, same demographic, which patient's going to come in on time? Patient A in a high constraint system or patient B in a low constraint system? The medical audiences would answer A, because we feel that we always talk to the caregivers, and the people who care the most about the patient probably going to be the one who get them to the hospital faster. It turns out it's the opposite. The answer is patient B. This is the person who comes in quickly. And you'll see right away it's because of how the social networks deliver information to the patient. With slow arrivers, the ones in those high constraint systems, the people around the person are actually blinded by love. The patient selectively discloses symptoms slowly, and then the group over-negotiates the symptoms, and then they all confirm a watch and wait plan, and there's no disruption of that idea to watch and wait. And this leads to delayed arrival. Whereas in the fast arrivers, there's a rapid transmission of information, and usually someone who takes over and says, something's wrong with you, you need to go to the doctor. They don't over-negotiate, and they act quickly. And so you see that the network has a real important effect on this patient's behavior. And that, by the way, is a real first step into the outcome of the patient's stroke, because if they get to the hospital quickly, they're able to get life-saving, life-changing medications, and that could really change the outcome of the stroke. All right, I just want to highlight another quick study. With Alvaro Pascual-Leon and others, we studied NFL players, participants who were former National Football League professional American football players. We studied their social networks after they played, so this is age 50s to 80s. And I just want to highlight that there's interesting differences in different populations. So we study the gender of the people in the network of the NFL football players. And what we found is, as compared to controls who are non-football players, former football players had a male-centric network. They were surrounded much more by men than by women compared to the average American non-football person. So that was a unique finding among this group. And then another unique finding is that the race distribution of the network members differed in white players and Black and other race players. It turns out the Black and other race players had a much more diverse network. They included in their social network white people as well as Black people or other race people, whereas white former football players only hung out with other white people. And that's also the case in controls. They only hang out with the race of their own race. So what this teaches us is that these social networks, which are influential, have diverse and distinct characteristics based on the populations and the social journey that you've taken. All right, just going to finish up with some new measures. What we're working on is actually trying to measure social interactions more objectively. So we have an NIH-funded project in which we are building a machine learning algorithm on a wearable watch in which it can detect the number of social interactions that someone has at any given time. It doesn't capture any content of the interaction. It just captures whether I'm talking and then someone else is replying and we are in interaction. And it captures the number of interactions, the time spent in interactions in a given day. You can see how this can be very important in order to help people increase their social interactions. We consider this the analog to a Fitbit. Instead of giving you a stair count, or a step count, we're giving you a social count of how many social interactions, how much time you spent social interaction. This is a demonstration of this device working on my wrist. I wore it for one day, and you can see it captures the types of interactions I had during a given 24 hours, whether I was at home or not. And importantly, it did not capture TV. The TV is one of the major false positives, and we made sure that it did not capture TV. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. I'm very happy to answer questions and to discuss the importance of social relations in addition to nutrition and physical activity that we've just heard about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Dhand, and very interesting talk. And now we are also very proud and very happy to introduce Joaquin Anguera. He's associate professor and director of the clinical division of Neuroscape at University of California at San Francisco. And as we have been seeing, there are many possibilities or strategies in order to influence on brain plasticity and brain health and strategies to improve cognition. And in order to close this last session, Professor Anguera is going to talk us how to use technologies in order to assess and train cognitive functions and trying to promote or to enhance brain health. So thank you very much, Professor Anguera, and welcome to the event.
Thank you, Ignacio. I think one of the most important things we should start with is simply, what are we talking about when we say cognition and cognitive enhancement? And everybody might have a different definition of what these abilities are. In this case, what my group and myself think about when we think about cognitive control abilities, we think about three things. One's ability to focus their attention, their ability to use working memory to keep things in mind and manipulate them, or what some people call goal management or cognitive flexibility, the ability to understand when to jump from task A to task B and then go back to task A. All of these things can change over the course of the lifespan, whether you're in a classroom as a child, or you're in your fertile working ages, or even as a senior. These abilities kind of begin low, they increase as in your adolescence, as a teenager in your 20s, 30s, but they have a slow decline over age. And what we're truly trying to get at here in our group is understand why these things change over time, but also what can we do to kind of make this curve towards the end less steep. Let's try to focus on improving quality of life at all of these stages, because as we know, small changes in these abilities can really have a profound effect at any of these time points. So the question I'm posing here is, what can we do to enhance our cognitive control abilities? The Lancet Commission on Dementia just came out this year, and they had this lovely slide kind of illustrating what are certain modifiable risk factors that one can actually do at different stages of their life, early, mid, and late life, that can actually have a profound effect on dementia as a whole. And rather than going through this list, it's interesting to see that there are a bunch of things one can do that will affect approximately 40% of dementias around the world. But that still leaves a pretty humongous slice of the pie in terms of things that we don't understand how we can manipulate, what they would do, or how they will impact our lives. Now, again, some of these things our mothers told us, and we understood very well that if you eat well, you'll live well, whether that's having a little bit of red wine, maybe not too much, but the right type of olive oils and fruit and what have you. And this, again, is one of those things we heard, that exercise can be good for your body, but in reality, we know it's also good for your brain as well. So these are couple of things that we know pretty well. Some of the things that maybe haven't been told us in the past have been stepping out of your comfort zone has been shown to be really beneficial to your brain health as well, especially thinking about these times in shelter in place with COVID. It makes this that much less accessible. And we have to think about other ways of doing it in terms of socializing, or definitely not traveling as we once did, hopefully soon. But these are the things that have had profound impact in terms of keeping one's brain sharp. If you'll think about to that slide I showed you earlier in terms of the Lancet, one thing that wasn't on there is in terms of mental exercises and actually challenging your brain in very prescriptive and precise ways, such as some people would say playing crossword puzzles or Sudoku. And sometimes you'll see brain fitness softwares advertised as things that can help stave off dementias or what have you. So there's a lot of different ways that folks can improve their cognition and try to enhance it. And here on this slide, I'm showing you the number of things I've mentioned, some other ones I didn't get to, such as more recent technological advances in terms of neurofeedback or modulation, or even pharmaceuticals, which we know there's a humongous industry on this. The one that I've highlighted here that I'll talk a little bit about is the work that comes out of my group, that is the use of video games. Now, these aren't the type of video games you'd pick up off the shelf that involve first-person shooters or driving a car and doing something wild that you find teenagers playing for 9 hours and feel fantastic after that. These are very different. These are the games that have been designed to push upon very specific neural circuits over and over and over again. And the interesting part is, after about 30 minutes of this, many times those same teenagers that would play Medal of Honor for 9 hours will put this one down intentionally and say, wow, my brain is tired. this all kind of stems from our group's underlying mission, which is like, can we use consumer technology for the good of brain health? And so at the center at UC San Francisco, I work out, we really try to bridge the gap between technology and neuroscience. And we try to utilize technologies that are either in our pockets, in our house, or just really equally accessible to all of us, and try to use them a little bit differently than they originally intended to try to improve brain health. So a lot of this came from some of the earlier work, which is, wow, now embarrassingly 7 years old, that we had this paper that was featured in Nature that demonstrated that a carefully designed intervention using these video game-like mechanics can actually be a really powerful agent for change. In this original study, we tested in a relatively small cohort, older adults that played this custom video game, and it showed that their behavior and some of their neural signatures began to look like that of a 20-year-old after simply a month of play. And these benefits persisted for 6 months without any type of intervention in between. Well, this was very exciting on many levels because it showed that there might possibly something to this if done in a scientifically rigorous manner. And these findings actually led to a company being spun out of these findings, one by our director, Adam Ghazali, where they founded a company called Emili, and they created an FDA-approved video game that was approved just this year for children with ADHD. Now that sounds a little bit like Star Trek or something very out of this world, but it's amazing to think that something can move along this cycle and be beneficial for a very specific population if prescribed, if designed in the right way for these groups. But again, the idea here is that there is an ability to use accessible technology to try to improve these deficits we might see. In this case, this video game actually showed in multiple studies now. On the left, I'm showing you a graph of their pivotal phase 3 trial to show that they actually had improvements in ADHD. And on the right is a study I helped lead showing a similar thing, that these children that played this game showed improvements. And on the right, that actually persisted for 9 months without doing anything in the meanwhile. So if we think about what I just showed you, showing that a video game can actually have these improvements, the other part of this is trying to make it accessible. And again, I mentioned this earlier, thinking about what we have going on in today with shelter in place, taking advantage of the technologies that we have access to right now. We should try to find a way to actually help anybody that might have these issues, especially across a lifespan. So one of these things we did a few years ago was trying to literally leverage this association between technology and mental health, and specifically trying to think about ways we could either better assess or remediate issues of mental health outside of the laboratory without having actually talked to anybody at all. And the question underlying all of this, one of my colleagues and friends, Pat Arian at University of Washington, was, can we improve mood using these type of brain games and really contribute in a meaningful way to mental health? So over the course of 6 months, we actually were able to enroll well over 3,000 individuals across the United States. And the simple thing here is we only did this by putting up ads on Craigslist. It was a very simple way of just saying, would you like to try something to try to improve your mood? And it was really fascinating. It was folks all over the country jumped all over this, and we're really excited to do this. What was even more exciting was actually we replicated this study in Spanish speakers about a year later, and the same thing happened again. What I find really fascinating and really exciting is that this was not simply for folks that happen to be maybe on a higher wealth factor, a high SES, what some might say, or certain very young that might be technologically accepting. Rather, we had folks across a lifespan from 18 to 70 plus that actually went and did this kind of work. And if you look at the ethnicity breakdown, this was not just for your typical white Americans. This was a nice breakdown. On the right, you see different pie charts of the ethnicity in our study called Brighton and the US Census, showing that they're pretty comparable. And this again, to me, speaks to the idea that if you actually package things the right way and present options for folks that typically have been thought of as saying, you know, I'm not going to reach out for mental health help. That's not true. If you position it the right way, it's seen that folks were willing and excited to do something for their mental health, and especially if it's done the right way. Simply to give you a quick overview of how this ended up, everybody seemed to improve on our different outcomes. But what was most important on this graph on the right, the folks that actually did an intervention that involved an active use of the app and actually interacting with it, that would be the green and the blue lines that kind of go down and then kind of plateau a little bit more, versus the one in the red, our control group, that kind of went down after 4 weeks. And then you can see they start to raise back up to levels they did more in the past. So it really speaks to the idea that those folks that have the most to gain got the most out of it. And these effects persisted even after the 4-week training itself, versus the folks that didn't, just had a passive message sent to them every day. Well, they might have got better over the first 4 weeks, but after that, nothing, they began to return to where they started, which is very similar to what you see when given certain pharmaceuticals. So this kind of approach can really help many distinct populations. I just showed you evidence from doing a large-scale clinical trial for folks with depression, but at this point in time, these types of technological approaches that we're trying to spin out using, again, mobile technology that most of us have, we're at this point doing a ton of different work with different populations that each have different types of cognitive deficits. And the unique thing that kind of wraps them all together is that all of them have issues of cognitive abilities at different stages and to different degrees. And again, going back to my earlier point, small changes in these abilities can really have profound impacts on one's quality of life. So what we're trying to do here is say, these type of games aren't the tool. They're just another tool in the tool shed that we can use, and maybe in certain situations might be more beneficial for certain populations who don't have access to traditional things that people might do, whether it's an improved environment, whether it's eating well, whether it's being able to go outside and exercise. This is another tool that one can use, and it's the cocktail of all these things that likely will make the biggest impact, just like that Lancet figure earlier saying that there's a bunch of modifiable things you can change that can have a really important impact in your life. So in summary, I'll just kind of wrap it up with this message that these video game mechanics can be really powerful ways of either assessing or augmenting cognitive control. And this is something that can be used across the lifespan in both healthy and distinct populations, excuse me. And this is just one of many other ways that we already know that can be used to try to boost plasticity and enhance cognition in the brain as a whole. With that, I'll just thank a couple of my key friends, Adam and Pat and my crew, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
What I see now is that we have questions, some specific questions, some more general questions. I'd like to start for the general ones. These are the first ones that we received, and I think they are very interesting because it touches, for example, the first one, it touches what has been said before. So the question is an anonymous sender and says, for all presenters, each intervention, nutrition, exercise, social connections, as they all have pointed out, should working together with the others. How do we find the dose for each person and support people to adhere? That's a very good one, and maybe hard one too. So I guess the question is has two parts. The first thing is if we all agree that we should intervene combining all the elements, because of course there is this issue of adherence, right? Then if you try to change everything at once, then it may be very difficult. And then the second one is the personalization of the doses that if each one should have. That's a very good one, I think. So anyone would like to answer?
Well, any lifestyle modification should be done with moderation in all of its aspects. I guess we are trying to see that people that are getting old, that they maintain their brain health. So we are going to, little by little, improve exercise, strengthen their social network, and also improve their nutrition by recommendations on plant-based foods and so on. I know that there has been experience with several multi-domain trials like Finger and MAPT and so on, doing all these precisely, when they haven't been much successful. So really, it's still controversial. Because they did precisely what the question raised. No? Do a little of all these things together. But in all these interventions, what I said at the end of my talk is that the people who are more at risk really had some benefit. Okay? So this is important, who we should target for these interventions.
more thoughts around this?
Sure. This is Art. We've done a trial, a couple of years ago where we tried to pull apart, both look at combined interventions and pull them apart. And although it was an interesting effort, it took an awful lot of time, energy, and sample size because we were including cognitive training with a program much like Joaquin talked about called Mind Frontiers. We were doing physical activity training. We were doing mindfulness training, and in some conditions we had dorsolateral prefrontal cortex stimulation peripherally. And our effort was both to look at the benefits of the joint or synergistic effects of the different components, but also to pull them apart and look at where the contributions were. And of course, that does require lots of unimodal and multimodal control conditions, along with the big condition that combines everything. So I think it's well worth doing. There are really, I guess the way I can see us doing this, there are two different ways to do it. There are ways that folks 30 years ago now looked at enriched environments with animals in which there were a number of animals housed together. There were toys or stimuli that were changed every 2 or 3 days, and there was a running wheel. And initially, the researchers, animal researchers at this time, looked at the combined benefits and then started pulling it apart. So I think we have to go one direction or the other, either design experiments where we can pull apart the contributions, or start with I think of it as the kitchen sink approach and then pull it apart later. And we're still pulling these things apart. I just went to a presentation last week in which there was a debate about whether exercise causes proliferation of neurons in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus or survival, or both. So these are long-term efforts, I think, but they're well worth doing. And in my opinion, we need to attack it from both ends of the continuum, the joint multimodal interventions, as well as the individuals that we build up, individual unimodal interventions that we build up gradually.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So to Professor Dhand, Joaquin and all, there is another question, and is if could you discuss the use of technologies, wearables, etc., to monitor the various lifestyles that you have discussed? How critical is to monitor the activity and the interventions and the performance?
Yeah, sure. So that's actually very important to our new direction. What we found is, these social networks have an impact. There have been interventions in cardiovascular disease in which social support was enriched, and similar to what Dr. Uros just said, they did not demonstrate dramatic changes in outcomes for at least the patient population after heart attack. And so what we've realized is we need a better metric. We need a more precise, updated metric that's perhaps more objective. And this is where I believe the wearables and other technologies come in, is when you can, passively collect the data of social interactions, for instance, and have a very tangible and easy to understand metric that people could then modify more easily than giving them a whole social network map and trying to say, change your social world. So we believe that the metric is important to provide a tangible target for improvement and to give feedback for the participants that we think could be a new generation of social enrichment or social enhancement interventions that could be more distinct and precise than the older style social support interventions. So that's why we're going that direction.
Yeah, and if I can echo something along those lines, I think part of the way with any of these technologies that collect data, the thing that's important to keep in mind is, what do you do with that data after? And I think the answer that was just given is really thoughtful, because you need to think about what the endpoint is, and the type of technology that we use, feedback becomes really important in terms of trying to give that back to the user to make them understand how they're doing. And so the feedback then has to be thought of ways of when do you give it and when's it going to be most important to the user. And so it can be on an immediate time scale during the given intervention, a little bit longer, so it's a bigger cycle of time so people can think about what just happened, and even a longer time scale so they can think about what has happened as a bigger experience that can be even that much more meaningful. So feedback is super important because it keeps folks engaged, but it's important is that it's packaged the right way so it keeps them motivated. And so thinking about how the feedback differs at different time scales and what it means to the user becomes that much more important for adherence and getting the most out of the experience in the first place.
Yeah, so actually, Joaquin, there was a question perhaps related to this, and I'm wondering if you already provide some answers. So the question was, looking at the evidence is shown by Javier Solana, looking at the evidence is showing cognitive training interventions, or is it difficult to control the variables affecting? How critical is to personalize interventions? Is it really worth maybe this feedback that you were talking already, some sort of personalization, right?
To some extent, yeah, but I think personalization is really the next stage for a lot of these types of technology, even the stuff that I'm involved with. We can't assume that one fit will go for everybody. And it's going to be really important to consider that some intervention, just like certain pharmaceuticals, aren't going to work for certain individuals. And so it's really important to begin to understand what works for whom and doing those initial trials, and then begin to tease those things apart. Just like Art mentioned, you need to have big power to understand individual differences and see who is going to benefit from what. And that's going to be the next stage of personalization with all these different kinds of technologies in the future, is beginning to understand what makes me different than you and somebody else. And then begin to understand that if we look at these types of technologies as a drug, well, we're going to give the right drug to the right person to try to get the most beneficial effects, but that requires some effort beforehand to really understand who would benefit most from what. And the feedback is just a part of it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Chema, you want to go ahead with another question?
Yeah, I'm just checking about the questions that was already asked, and there was one question I think interesting for Professor Kramer, and is regarding the apparently change in the tendency from aerobic training to resistant training in the last years, and whether you believe this is or could be related to practical and safety reasons.
I think we're learning a lot more about resistance training. Initially, we started out with animal models of aerobic training. It's easy to do wheel running or treadmill running for monkeys or even dogs. I have a Elgato sitting here with me. They don't do anything you ask them to do. So a cat, I'm not so sure. But at least some organisms will run or walk quite a bit. And the translation was to humans. For resistance training, there are ways to do resistance training with animals, walking downhill, tying a weight to the animal's tail. But it's been much more difficult to have animal models, molecular and cellular based models for resistance training. So I'm glad we're finally moving into resistance training with humans, even though it's more difficult to have good animal models there. And the data, there was a paper that just came out, I think speaker this morning, I don't know if he presented it, but Valenzuela is the senior author on a paper that came out really recently in 2020 on hippocampal plasticity and resistance exercise and mild cognitive impairment. So there clearly is much more work being done on resistance training. People have asked me what is the best to do, and my answer is you should be doing everything, especially if you're older, because our muscles atrophy if we don't use them. If we don't use our balance, which you can improve with Tai Chi and yoga, we fall over, break our hips, and go to a nursing home, and the outcome is never good. And of course, aerobic training, we know, can improve cardiorespiratory fitness and decrease the probability of stroke, heart attack, and all-cause mortality. So I'm glad we're expanding. I've been doing some work with a group in mainland China on Tai Chi. I've done some work with colleagues in the United States on yoga, and we've seen benefits for all of them. I don't even know how to answer the question about which is the best, because it's like comparing apples, oranges, and grapefruits. I don't know what unit of exercise with weights or resistance exercise equates to a unit of aerobic exercise or so forth. So I think it's nice that we're starting to gain more research using neuroimaging techniques, mostly MRI, but also ERPs, EEG, near-infrared spectroscopy, that we can learn more about all of these forms of exercise. I think much the same way as Joaquin does. This is really a toolkit. And, you know, some people may benefit from some things and some people may benefit from others. And some people don't like to exercise. So cognitive training or social interaction or diet might be the way to go. I think we need to offer our citizens across the world options of what can keep them healthy. And the truth is probably doing all of them is the best case, but very few people do all of these things right. I certainly don't.
I have a question for Amar. I think I found it very interesting, but a bit perhaps paradoxical. This seems that these more, I don't know how you put the name, but the loose networks compared to the tight ones are somehow beneficial for conditions like stroke recovery or even prevention, as you mentioned. But do you think this may be different when considering social connections and relations in the sense of brain development, during development? Because I think that we need to have also very solid and very tight connections, right? So meaningful, maybe more qualitative than quantitative one. So is it possible that the type of social network can be protective differently depending on what we are considering?
Yes, absolutely, David. The optimal social network depends on the outcome that you are trying to optimize. And unfortunately, there's no ideal for all the outcomes. So for instance, in stroke, arrival to the hospital is facilitated by those larger disconnected networks, looser ties, like you're saying. But recovery is facilitated by large connected networks of people who are better communicators with each other and who can take turns and who can mitigate the burden of taking care of one person so that it's not just a single caregiver. So even in the stroke example, there's contrasting patterns. And I think you're right. I think we're just starting to get in pediatric studies, and probably particularly in the younger ages, that close-knit networks of love and care are intuitively going to be very important for the brain's development. So I think you're right, and I think there's a differential impact. I think it's important. My closing point would be it's important to figure out what is the idea, what are the maps at different ages, and how do we identify those who are socially isolated and socially deficient, so that we can track them into interventions that would be socially geared. And so I think all these intervention talks, I think, need to begin with understanding what is their baseline, so that we can triage them correctly in terms of the multimodality interventions.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think that we have still a time for at least for one more question, and there is a question addressed to Joaquin Anguera, and the question says that considering the very different results of cognitive control trial programs and the variability of parameters, doses, tasks that have used, what do you think that could be a good way to build a strong ground on to develop new studies, and how to design more accurate studies in order to get more solid results?
I think it's like any other science, frankly. There's a lot of junk and garbage out there. especially in the brain training field, that I think has clouded the waters and somewhat made the idea that these things don't or can't work. And I think it just requires folks like myself and others that think there's something to this to do really rigorous science and show that there is something to it. And I think it's just it's okay. It inspires me, frankly, to make sure that my work is that much better, because I need to show that there is something to this. And I think by doing so, it just will elevate the whole field. And so to the question, what can we do? I think it's just really thinking about what would the best studies look like in terms of having the most possible research folks enrolled, having other methodologies that are validated to show that there is something to this, whether that's better behavioral measures, better neural markers, maybe more physiological things. But the whole idea here is trying to elevate everything so that the science itself rises above the muck that has been out there for some of these things that have just more advertised than science. And you begin to show there's something actually evidence-based in all this type of work.
And I think that this is a question to all of you, and I think that it could be a nice question in order to close the session. And is do you believe that should clinicians start prescribing the lifestyles modification discussed along the session? Do you consider it is time to adopt this into practice and go beyond generic recommendations?
Absolutely. I actually have a few t-shirts that I've gotten at medical conferences that say exercise is medicine, and it is. And so are these other lifestyle differences, or can be, and they can be prescribed just as pharmaceuticals can be prescribed. Of course, it's harder to get people to do some of these things. Exercise isn't easy. If you're dealing with 70 and 80-year-olds who say, I haven't exercised my whole life and I drink a lot of whiskey and I'm still alive, and maybe you can be alive a little longer without a stroke or a heart attack. You never know.
Yeah, I took the words out of my mouth. I think, yeah, exercise has been and should be prescribed and things like that, but it's just a matter of what are you going to get the person to be willing and able to do, right? And so I think that goes back to the idea of this has to be almost a menu. Here's a whole bunch of things you could do. You get to choose what you will do. Obviously, the more things on this menu you're willing to do, you're probably going to get the most out of it and most bang for your buck when it comes to your health. And so I think that's why, should it be prescribed? Why? A lot of this stuff already is. And it's a recommendation, but at the end of the day, it's the user that has to make a decision of what am I going to do for myself and what am I willing to do. And so making it more as appealing as possible is probably the best thing you can do.
This kind of lifestyle advice is not only good for the brain, it's good for all non-communicable diseases. I mean, if you have a good nutrition, exercise, and stay lean, and have a kind of a happy life through your social networks, you'll have less cancer, less cardiovascular disease, less osteoporosis, and obviously less Alzheimer's disease. So it's really, and you'll live longer. So it's just a counsel for overall health. So I guess certainly you should always try to push that to all your patients.
Yes, I concur as well. As a practicing doctor, I am prescribing these things. I think what is helpful, though, is to provide them with some kind of structured program or tangible methods to keep track of them and to do it in a systematic way. And that we haven't figured out as a field, and we haven't shown how to execute and operationalize this. But yes, I think in principle, all of these things are incredibly important to our health, and we should be actively encouraging it in the clinic.
Okay, Chema, I think you're mute.
I'm mute. So thank you very much to all of you. I mean, I think that has been a very intense journey. We are from the 9:30 in the morning, almost with short stops. But we have, I think that we have two things. One is a really good feeling that the concept and the expectations on the topic on brain health and how to improve brain function and brain connectivity has changed a lot in the last 5 years. I think we have I think that we are in changing the paradigm with specific things that we can do in order to improve our brain health, and in the same way that we have been doing during many years with cardiovascular health. We still don't know how to repair the stroke, the infarct, but we have decreased a lot the mortality from cardiovascular origin, and I think that we could see in following years something regarding neurological disability. We are really thankful of your time that you dedicate up your times, and thank you very much to all of you and to all of the audience.